Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tanchaz Talk, the world's only English language program focusing primarily on Hungarian folk music. My name is Kalman Magyar Öcsi. I'm your host, coming to you from Toronto, Canada. Episodes of Tanchaz Talk, which combine a mix of music and stories delivered by yours truly, are available as always on tanchaz.com, that's Tanchaz.com, and on YouTube. Just search Tanchaz Talk on YouTube and subscribe so you don't miss anything. Today, though, we have an episode of Tanchaz Talk Interviews. This is where I delve into long-form interviews with a wide array of guests. Episodes of Tanchaz Talk Interviews are available on all popular podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify podcast platforms. So make sure you subscribe and leave a nice review if you like what you hear. Today I am very excited to have on the program my old friend and the folk dance expert, Steve Kotansky, calling in from the outskirts of New York City. Steve Kotansky was born in 1951 in New York, raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then moved to Southern California after high school. He studied dance for a couple of years at the University of California at Los Angeles, at UCLA. And down there in Los Angeles, he danced with the prestigious Aman, A-M-A-N, folk dance ensemble, Aman of Los Angeles. He started his first research trips going to Hungary and the former Yugoslavia in the early 1970s, and Steve moved to Germany in the 70s, where he lived for 6 or 7 years, teaching international folk dance there and continuing his research trips to Hungary, in particular in the 1970s, where he studied with the dance master Timar Sándor, whose name comes up often on the podcast and on the show, among others. It was during this time that Steve met his future wife, Susan Snyder. Steve has taught at every major North American festival and camp in the Balkan scene, and that includes Hungarian dancing as well, and oftentimes with Susie. And he also teaches dance to children in New York City area public and private schools. A little more about Steve's background with respect to Hungarian dancing. Steve and Susie, they founded and co-directed the Guzsai Dance Ensemble. Who remembers that name in New York City? And they worked closely with Zoltán Zsuravszky, Zoltán Farkas, Batyu, Ferenc Sára, among others, who came to New York to choreograph and teach their ensemble. And Steve has also served as a consultant to several Hungarian folk ensembles. If you saw Gypsy Spirit several years ago touring, Steve had worked with Jura's group there on some of the Balkan elements of the dance. Steve and Susie have 2 grown children, Maya and Jesse, who himself is a very accomplished professional musician. Steve's classes are very popular. His teaching methods, if you've ever seen him, it's half dance and half history and anecdotes. He's very, very popular and very much in demand all over, not just North America, but the world. If you've never heard of Steve and you are a fan of the Tanchaz, you probably should have. In my estimation, he's probably taught Hungarian dancing to more non-Hungarians than anyone else in the United States. And so he's quite prolific in his reach, has been doing it for not many, but several decades now. I'm very, very happy to have Steve Kotansky join us from the phone. Hello, Steffi.
Hi, Öcsi. Nice to see you. Hear you.
Indeed.
I've seen you. Yeah. By the way, I actually lived in Munich and Europe from 72 to 1980, so 8 years.
Oh, in Munich. Wow. So, well, we're going to talk about your experience there. And so you speak German, right?
I speak German, Magyarul, and Serbian, and or Croatian. It was called Serbo-Croatian when I studied it.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, those are three languages that I'm probably most proficient in German, but I can get around in the other two.
Your English is pretty good, though, so let's stick with English, Steve. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yours isn't bad either.
Yeah, I have a little accent, you know. Crossing the border. Well, crossing the border once, they asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from New Jersey." And the guy's like, "No, where are you actually from?" And I had to explain Hungarian was my first language, and I didn't speak any English until I was 4 or 5. I've known you and your wife. Well, you've known me, I think, all my life, pretty much, or close to it. We go back a long way in the New York area, and I'm already upset at myself because I know I'm gonna be missing some a lot of material. So you have to promise me, you're gonna come back at some point to keep talking, because Steve's experience goes, just well beyond Hungary, and it's a very not just micro level, but then you get this macro experience as well, listening to Steve and his stories and tying in all the various cultures of Eastern and Central Europe. Steve, I know you're a closet.
Thank you, Öcsi.
Thank you. I know you're a closet Hungarian, but what's your actual ethnicity, your background?
Okay, well, it's interesting because I didn't know that until I started folk dancing in California. And I remember coming home one day, and after having learned a dance that many folk dancers are familiar with, it's actually a choreography by a man named Anatol Kotansky called Hungarian Chardash. So here you have the Slavic and the Hungarian. It's a Slovak-based dance. And I asked my dad, "What are you? What are we?" Excuse me. He said, "What do you mean, what are we? We're American." And I said, "No, the ski." And he said, "Why, is somebody bugging you about it?" And I said, No. I learned this dance called Hungarian Chardash. And I was just curious. And he started singing in Slovak. So his first language was Slovak. He was born in the United States this is my father's side of the family. He was born in Illinois, in Streator, Illinois, which was a Slovak Carpatho-Rusine enclave. And he had grown up, like I said, speaking Slovak. Interestingly, too, when I was a kid, my father was a publisher. He had published the Kodai method of teaching children and invited Zoltan Kodai over to the States twice to lecture at Stanford and Boston. And I actually, as a kid, met Zoltan Kodai and had to play the piano for him, which was a joke. Oh. So as a kid, I did that. But then I discovered folk dance, and in high school, and at Stanford University, we would go folk dancing, and that's where I discovered what my paternal side of the family was. So it's Slovak and Carpatho-Rusine from all the research I've done, and the family actually comes from what was part of Austria-Hungary, in that eastern Slovakia region around Prešov and Košice, or Kasha, as the Hungarians say. And my mother's side is mixed Western European, even some Scandinavian. I did an Ancestry.com DNA test, and I found out that I'm 51% from that area of Central Europe.
Wow. So you didn't get into dancing through that Slovak Carpatho-Rusine background of yours?
No. Although it's interesting, I don't know if I mentioned this, when my father, he started singing in Slovak, because that's what he learned at a Catholic school, the first school he went to in Streator, Illinois.
Mm-hmm. So your first exposure to folk dance was, I guess, in California, Northern California, at Stanford University. You were in high school, but there would be these dances at Stanford. Was this similar to what was going on in New York at Columbia University?
Yeah, it was in the 60s. It was very popular at many university towns, and I actually, we would be taught square dancing and social dance in junior high, and I, along with some friends, actually taught a folk dance class in our gym class at my high school. Anyway, yeah, it was very popular in the 60s. And there were, in the Los Angeles area, there were clubs, but in the northern, and clubs were starting to pop up in the Bay Area, too, where I was growing up. So there were international and Balkan Israeli groups.
Mm-hmm. So these are circle dances, and mostly Balkan and Israeli. You pretty much spinning records, no live music at that time.
Yeah, all records. Even still, 78s were being used. There were these. It's interesting. There were these record players called caliphones that were calibrated. You could slow them down a little, and so records at that time were 78s, 45s, and 33s, and some EPs. And there were also some couple dances that were popular, and especially some of the Hungarian dances at that time that were popular were dances that Andor Czompo had taught, and one or two things that were much older from Vicz Balayas that didn't even have Hungarian names. They had crazy translations.
What caught your eye and your passion in terms of dance then?
Well, I think I know in the beginning I was really into the Balkan. I liked the line dances, the fast dances, the tricky footwork, the music, and also the mixed rhythms. The Balkan rhythms were really intriguing. But I also loved the Hungarian sound. There was something that struck a nerve when I heard Hungarian or Slovak music, and there were a few dances and there were couple dances, or men's or women's, the women's circle dance. There were some of those, but also Andor had made up a Kapuvadi Verbung, and there was Szörnyi Verbung, and later I learned Kun Verbung. But none of these were, how should I put it? They were created choreographies.
Right. Well, that's a name we can't really skip over. Hasn't come up yet really in any of our episodes, but Andor Czompo, who passed away a couple of years ago now, he was, I would say, and Steve, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but the first real teacher of Hungarian folk dancing within the folk dance community, within that Stanford, Columbia, whatever, the camps going on already within that community. Is that what you understand as well?
I think that's true. There were some names that pop up if you do dance research, and off the top of my head, I'd have to go look at my notes. There were a few people who had brought things into the folk dance community, but Andor was the first one who really got things started. And then it's interesting because in '69 at Stanford, where I was mentioning that I danced, Csaba Palfi was invited over to the States, and he taught at Stockton Folk Dance Camp, and then he also taught workshops in the California area. So I met Csaba, who was very important in my connection to Tanchaz dance, that we can get into later.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting. Andor in the beginning, he didn't think that he also taught at a university in a physical education department, and I think he used to say a lot that he believed that fixed choreographed dances is what the folk dancer in the United States needed. But he changed his mind later as he became good friends with Timash Andor, and he began himself to bring in some Tanchaz style dancing.
Right. That's a huge thing to understand that the Israeli and the Balkan is generally a fixed pattern that's repetitive. There's some improvisation within each pattern, but and I'm generalizing, Steve. And trying to break Hungarian dancing into that world was a challenge, and of course even more challenging pre-Tanchaz movement because we really didn't know the various regions that well at that time. So that's an interesting challenge that came up early on, and I think Andor initially had it right, and that's how you kind of break in, and we see that now too. I mean, Moldvai and dances like that, which actually are more or less Romanian, but there's some mixture there. But those are very, very popular to grab new people, grab new folks into the Tanchaz.
Absolutely. And you see that very strongly, or did see that until recently, very strongly in Hungary as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the most popular Tanchazes were the Thursday night Moldvai Tanchaz, which unfortunately I think they lost their space, and I don't know if they've refound a new space. But that was a very popular Tanchaz.
Yeah.
And again, you could show up without a partner, even though you could do that at the FM, Haas or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You can show up without a partner and usually find someone, but that was very popular because of that. And interestingly, you would have the circle dance going around the outside, and on the inside, a lot of people would be doing couple dances to, for example, hora or surba,
right.
Which, here you go again, not too Hungarian as far as nomenclature goes.
Yeah. Well, but the spirit is the Carpathian Basin spirit, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're a teenager, you really get smitten, obviously, Stephen, so much so that you decide to go down to Los Angeles and to study at UCLA and to join Amman. Tell us about UCLA. I know you spent just 1 or 2 years there, but in the folk dance program, but what were they teaching back then? What was the curriculum like?
Okay, well, let me back up just a little. So high school, I'm in, by the way, in the Bay Area, I was dancing with with West Wind, which was a pretty prestigious international folk dance group there, performing group. And what did I dance there? It's funny, we danced Daughter de Burgers and Körösztöző, and then we also did a dance that Andor had taught them, Sarkantús. So there were choreographies that we were doing that were already Hungarian. I decided I went to UCLA. I chose 3 colleges that had dance programs, and then I ended up going to UCLA as a dance major, but found out early on that I had to be a modern dance major and go through 4 years of dance before I could focus on ethnic dance. And I was, really wanting to study ethnic dance because I always loved the cultural aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So I didn't last long as a dance major, but in Los Angeles I danced with Amman. I danced with a group called the Liberty Ensemble, which was an American folk dance group that was run by the Ivanchuks, and I danced in a Russian group.
Jeez.
Then so I'm performing in all these groups at the same time. I'm dancing 7 nights a week at the different coffee houses throughout Los Angeles. Los Angeles had primarily besides the international folk dance scene, they had a coffee house scene, which each night would be different. You'd have Balkan night, you'd have Israeli night, you'd have Greek night, and some nights would be a little more mixed. Mm-hmm. But usually when they're mixed, they were Balkan and Israeli primarily.
Was there live music or spinning records still?
No, it was, well, here, thanks for asking that, because it was still spinning records, although out of Amman, there was a group called Pitu Guli, and they were friends of mine, dancers and musicians in Amman, who began to play traditional, quote-unquote, Bulgarian and Macedonian instruments. Mm-hmm. And they put together an ensemble that was like a Beethoven orchestra in Bulgaria, or a Izvorni, Izvorno, mm-hmm. as they called that in Macedonia. And they were playing the repertoire of Bulgarian folk instrument groups, or Petre Atanasovsky's radio television ensemble from Skopje, primarily. And I sort of became the mascot to that group and would go wherever they went and often lead these different dances, which were not so often choreographed. They were more, we would do 20-minute bravos, or, dances that weren't necessarily in the choreographed Balkan movement.
Nice. Amman, the group, is very important. I think it no longer exists, unfortunately. But when people ask me about it before, I kind of envision it. I say it's like almost a tamburitsins for adults. But it's more. They did the scope of Amman's was also Asian and other cultures
Yeah,
and other continents.
There were two major groups in the Amman in the 70s that I was in. It was founded by Tony Shea and Leona Wood. Mm-hmm. And Tony, although he was very well versed in Persian music and dance, he focused on the Balkan section, and Leona on the Oriental or Middle Eastern, as it was often called, which extended even into Africa and even further east. And then within the larger group was the Balkan section, and it had the tall and the short group. And then there were and Tony based a lot on his experience and his love, I should say, of Croatian dance. Mm-hmm. He loved Lado. Lado was his model that he emulated, and he loved the costuming. He liked what he could do with that. And as you said, it was sort of like a Tamburitsins group for adults. You had to try out for it, and we met twice a week to rehearse. On Sundays, a long rehearsal with musicians, and on Thursday nights we had a separate Balkan dance, Balkan section rehearsal.
Did you guys get paid?
No, not at all. But sometimes we would get asked to teach. Many of us were teaching at the different coffee houses,
right?
And there we would get paid. But as at that time, it was a purely amateur, not voluntary. I mean, you had to try out, but it was voluntary. But nobody got paid.
Right.
Later they changed that. After I left, there was an outreach program that went into schools, and they began they became semi-professional in that sense that many of the performers would get paid. That was after my time. I left in 72.
Right. It sounds like a very robust scene going on in Los Angeles at that time, and Amman has an important relationship with the Kárpátok group there, or had one. I know there were some people in both, like Don Sparks, for instance, and
I used to go to Kárpátok rehearsals also with Tibi and with Attila in the early days. I was more or less chasing the beautiful Hungarian women.
Right, right. Yeah, we all do that. It burned a lot of calories. So you mentioned.
By the way, you mentioned Kárpátok. You should also mention Betyárok. Betyárok was primarily non-Hungarian. There was one couple that had Hungarian background, but that was Elsie Dunnan, who with the help of Andor and about 6 couples had a Hungarian performing group called Betyárok. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on. Can I just ask you a follow-up about tall boys or tall group and short group? Like literally, he cut the group into half because some ethnicities or some regions have short people and tall people?
No, because Tony was very stage oriented. And it was a good way to teach a lot of material too. We did a lot of joint pieces, but he liked the idea of what's the word I should use? Just all the tall men or tall women together, and the shorter men and short women together on the stage. It just had a better look in his aesthetic.
And of course, you're quite tall, so you're probably in a tall group.
Yeah, I'm 6'2.5". Exactly. I like to add the half because it takes a little from the width.
Yeah. So, Steve, first research trip to Hungary. When was it? Tell me about it. What did you see?
Okay, in 1970, between going from high school to UCLA, I went to Europe with my family, and I parted with them. I went to Vienna to visit a friend of mine who was a folk dancer. She was a Stanford. She's still very active in ethnic music. Dr. Jane Sugarman. Okay. And Jane did work eventually in Albania, but had also gone to Macedonia. Was studying in Vienna. I went to Vienna, and then I got on a train, and I went to Budapest. And through my father, I had connections with the director of the Liszt Institute. Her name, she just passed away last year. I got to see her just before she passed away. Eletfa Szörnyi. She was Kodai's assistant. And I had met her in the States, and she was lovely, spoke beautiful English. And she had connections, and she got me in touch and got me to go to rehearsals where the Alami was rehearsing with Rabbi Miklos. Wow. And I got to meet him, and he allowed me to do some Super 8 videos of some dancers. I told him I was interested in the Férfi táncok and men's dances, and he had some of his dancers dance that for me. And then he invited me to join the group in Debrecen, but I'd have to get myself there. So I took a train to Debrecen, and for 4 days I hung out with the state ensemble back in 1970. And every night I sat in the audience with Rabbi Miklos, who spoke beautiful English. And he basically, this is interesting, I'd like to share this, because he basically had sort of a Moiseyev type model for his choreographies, which he said to me in English, these people out here don't understand that. And he said, I really don't like doing it, but I'd rather do research. And if you look at his biography, there's some beautiful pictures of him when he's out with peasants doing filming. I mean, all of these people, like Miklos, Rabbi Miklos, and later Martin George and the Peshovar brothers, and all these people, you can just see there was this real love of doing peasant research along the lines of Bartók and Kodály, a few others who had done that before. I see a lot of those pictures, and even having worked with or been with Szörnyi Erzsébet, she took me out to the countryside where they would go and they would be on panels to watch different musicians and singers and dancers and such. So that was always I think a passion of these early pioneers, I guess is a good word for them, in the folk dance performance and research in Hungary.
So that's interesting. You know, they're still dedicated to research, but ultimately what went on stage was a very Moiseyev style, and there were political reasons probably behind that. Also, you know, they had to make a living,
absolutely.
And that was the thing to do. But you don't hear much about Rabbi. At least I haven't heard much about his research work. I know him as the choreographer of some of the greatest, most classic Hungarian state folk ensemble choreographies, such as Ecseri Lakodalmas and Kálai Kettős and the like. But it's,
and actually, your dad, bring your dad into this, because I remember your father had some of those early 16mm films of the state ensemble that we just loved watching. I would sit in your living room, and you were probably still very, very young, but your dad and I would watch. And one of the films I'll never forget, because your dad had that, was the Kuhnwerbung, which was pretty much a choreography when you see the village version, which I've seen, and what they call this crazy thing called the Tzigán Tanz, which was a very, very much a Moiseyev thing, where somebody's even pulled way up off the stage it's crazy.
Yeah, just to harken back to my first interview I had with Kalman Magyar, we talked about the Tzigán Tanz as well, and these themes do come up. But this is pre-Tanchaz movement that you're first seeing these guys spending an unbelievable 4 days in Debrecen. These are still though the red boots and the pointy toes type of style of dancing that you're seeing more.
Yeah, and tight pants, tight men in tights, and men in tights. Yeah,
men in tights. Yeah.
And but the interesting thing is, you even had Kodály composing music for some of the suites. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was a big orchestra and a chorus. So the original Alami was that chorus, dancers, and orchestra.
Yeah.
And when I later, when we were in Hungary, Susie and I, early on, that still when Timar took over the state ensemble, he still had to keep the chorus and the large orchestra, and then he brought in the kamara, the little kamara orchestra, which was different groups like Dega and Shebu and all these different small groups, and it was sort of a transitional period, and all the dancers, including Batu and Jura and Mickey and all these people and met, who later started the Kodai Edutesh. All those people were trained and had to learn all these major choreographies, these older choreographies or older style choreographies, the stage choreographies.
That's right. And then we'll be hearing in a couple of days from Levent Aseke, who was also one of the musicians in that transitional period.
Right.
And his wife, Heidi.
And Heidi was a dancer, and his wife was a dancer in that group.
Well, not only that, I believe she was in the same class as Juran Botyu and the rest of the clan there, so that's interesting.
Yeah, she was, and she was. I remember seeing her dance, in these not in the 70s. But, it was in the 70s. It wasn't 1970. But in that transitional period, I think that's very interesting, where all of these young dancers who were instrumental in getting the Tanchaz going, or in dancing in the Tanchaz, were also dancing in the Bartok ensemble, were also professional dancers to make ends meet in the state ensemble, or in the army ensemble, or what have you. And it's just fascinating, because you could see how they were, politically they had to make that transition happen slowly. It couldn't just happen overnight, because you had too many people who were already invested in it and who had lifelong careers in it. So it had to happen delicately.
That's right, delicately.
At least that's my understanding.
That's a lovely word for it, I think. Steve,
and it's interesting, in the Hungarians in our own country, in Canada, were also kind of walking that thin line, interested in what these younger people had to offer and bring, but still there, the Hungaria and Daisika Kalman and those people, they had started by sort of emulating the state ensemble choreographies, and there would be huge arguments too that I didn't understand, because my Hungarian was poor. But there were a lot of people who didn't believe that the Tanchaz type of music and dance was Hungarian, because of so much of it was inspired by Hungarians from Transylvania, and I remember people showing up at when there would be an interview or something, and they had pieces of paper in their hand to argue that this was not Hungarian music. It was funny. And that was at the Liga, or at the Cherkes house. There was one night where your dad had organized a lecture and then questions with I can't remember his name. I have it. He was a ethnomusicologist. Very famous one, who was at that time, I have his book in my library, but I can't go in there right now. But afterwards, there were people who were there primarily just to challenge him. They were there to challenge his, because that there was still a strong sense and feeling that these were communists, and we were. The 1956 had divided a lot of passions.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. When you were going in the early 70s to Hungary, so your first trip you mentioned is 1970. Beyond seeing the State Folk Ensemble and having the great honor of sitting next to Rabai Miklos for 4 nights in Debrecen watching the performances, were you able to go to the countryside or hop over into Transylvania despite the tough border crossing?
No. It was a tough border crossing, and I have a story. I don't know if we have time for it, but
that's all we have is time. So please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I laugh about this, because here's this kind of naive American kid just out of high school in Debrecen saying goodbye to the state ensemble. They all got on their bus and went wherever they were going. That may have been, I think they were going to another place to do a series of concerts. That's what they did. They would travel in their bus around Hungary and do concerts. And I was off to Transylvania. And so I sat. I was here's the picture. I'm at Debrecen train station. I'm thinking, to the left is east, to the right is west. So I'm waiting for this train, and the names in those areas are so long and everything, and it's all in Hungarian. I'm waiting for a train to come from the right that I get on to take me to the left, not knowing that in order to get to Romania, I would have had to go back towards Budapest and caught a different train that cuts further southeast to get to Romania. So I missed my train to Transylvania, and not only did I miss that, but my visa ran out, and boy was I in trouble. I was staying in a nice hotel, no more room there. I had to stay the night. Somebody explained to me in broken German, and he shared with me his fish soup and palinka. He worked there. I was filming trains going by with my Super 8, including a Russian military train.
Oh,
that's how naive I was. Nothing happened, though. When I was walking around with this guy between the trains as he checked everything, and he got me into a hotel where I got bitten by bed bugs. The next morning, I went to the police station, explained my situation in broken English to a guy who spoke a little English and German, and he explained to me exactly, what had happened. He gave me a stamp that gave me enough time to get back to Budapest and get out of the country. Because in those days, you had to pay per day to stay. As an American, you had to have a visa, and you had to pay, I think, like $12 or $16 a day to make sure you spent Western currency. So I went back. I got back to Vienna, took a shower, and got on the next train and went south to Croatia, and that's a whole different. That's a whole different point of in my life. That took me into Balkan dance more than I'd ever been before. But I didn't forget Hungary, but I just wasn't going to go back and try to get into Transylvania at that point. I had a limited time. I had to meet my family. But I'll never forget that day, thinking I'm going to Transylvania, and I ended up back in Vienna and then on into Croatia, into Zagreb.
How interesting!
And there I went to.
Things might have ended up very differently for you, Steve, if you do go east, and I had cut you off, but in Zagreb you went where?
Oh, from Zagreb, it's funny. I went to the Smotra Folklora, which was their big folklore festival in Zagreb, and I met this young guy my age, who was very interested in his folklore, and he took me back to his town, which was Bjelovar, and I stayed with him for a good week and fell in love and had a blast and saw village dancing. I mean, at that point, you're not finding village dancing. You're finding groups of villagers who are encouraged to get together and dance sometimes. I mean, there's a whole movement that took place between the wars that from World War I and World War II. In Hungary, it was called the Gyöngyös Bokreta. Are you familiar with? You're familiar with
yes.
The Pearly Bouquet, where village groups were encouraged to keep their costumes up and their dances. The same thing was going on in Yugoslavia. It was called, and the name is slipping me. It was called, Seljačka Sloga, which meant Peasants' Union. So the same idea was going on. It was all based on what the Germans, this is my understanding of it. It was based on what the Germans called Trachtenverein, which meant, so Seljačka Sloga meant the Peasants' Union. Trachtenverein kind of meant the costume union. And these two were movements toward preservation and resurrection of dance, and it was going on in the United States to some degree too, with the folk music. I guess it was going on in most Western countries since the late 19th century, where there was an attempt to keep some of these traditional, whatever that means, forms of dance music and costume and all that alive, or at least preserved.
So, is this your first trip to Europe? You spend the time in Hungary and then down to Croatia. When does the rest of Yugoslavia opened up for you, and including your very well-known passion about Albanian folklore.
Okay, well, I used to go up to San Francisco a lot. I came back and I went to UCLA, as I said, and I knew the festival record store in Los Angeles and the one up in San Francisco, and I would always go hunting for different kinds of music. That's where I first heard Albanian music, actually. I found an English album by Lloyd, L.A. Lloyd, called Music of Albania, and that kind of and there were also some things that were coming out of Yugoslavia. So let me just jump. So I got a scholarship in 1972 based on a woman named Ruby Vuceta, who had perished in a car accident in Vojvodina, and on her way back to Belgrade. And she was a folk dance teacher at the intersection, and they had a scholarship to go to Yugoslavia. And I it's funny, it was pretty much between me and Steve Murillo, and somehow there were people who chose me over Steve, and I got this scholarship to go to folk dance camps in Yugoslavia, including in 1972, including Petses, and including 2 weeks on the island of Badia, which is near where they had a summer folklore school for foreigners and for Yugoslavs. This is when Yugoslavia was still a country. But before then, I went with my parents back to Hungary, and I went back to Budapest in the Balaton region, and then, but not so much for folk dance research, more to just be with them. And I went and saw some performances, and again we went with Erspeth Cerny, and we went out to the countryside and saw some panels where they had local people dancing and singing. But I ended up getting into Yugoslavia, this is 72 in May, and I met up with Bob Liebman, and Bob and I went to a number of festivals in the south, to Serbia, and then we went together to villages. We saw a bunch of groups from there. We went to villages in southern Serbia and in eastern Serbia. Then we went down to Macedonia to several folk dance festivals where traditional groups danced, and groups came from other countries, including Albania and Bulgaria. Went to Petses camp and just went to weddings, and just did research all over that region. Went back up to Croatia, spent a week there filming village groups. Then I met up with Marty Koenig, and he and I went with his girlfriend. We went to Dubrovnik and the island of Mljet, and then I went back for 2 weeks. I was there for like 2.5, 3 months in former Yugoslavia, and just filming, learning, dancing, learning language, having the time of my life.
Yeah.
I was what was I then? I was maybe 21, just having a blast, and I'd learned. By then I was pretty proficient, at least in the language, at least in the language with a dance vocabulary, but also having a grand time and learning and living the culture in a way, or what I perceive to be the culture.
Right. Is that when you decided to stay in Europe and live in Munich?
Yeah. Then at this camp, actually at this seminar, it was 20-day seminar on the island of Mljet. The Croatians would divide. They had divided the folklorists in Yugoslavia had pretty much divided Yugoslavia into 6 major zones of music, dance, and what have you, based on geography and history. And that year they had the Dinaric zone, which included parts of Croatia, Bosnia, and into Montenegro. That was 1 week, and the second week was the Morava zone, Serbian. And I met a number of people I had met before from Serbia. I met Ivan Chan, who was the big ethnochoreologist from Croatia. Later became the artistic director for Lado, and I met people from Kolo, and I met a tremendous amount of people, from villagers to those people who were big in the folk dance and folk music, folk performance world. So I've been meeting people who were related to Tanets, to Kolo, and to Lado. For those who aren't familiar with those things, those are the sort of the state-sponsored professional ensembles. Right. And yeah, that was 72. And I met a woman in the second week at the Badia folk dance seminar, and she was from Munich, and we fell in love, and I drove back with her to Munich, and I ended up spending the summer 1972 during the Olympics, that horrific event in Munich, and then I came back to the States for a short period of time, a couple months, and just needed to get back to Europe, so I went back to Munich, and I ended up living in Munich from 72 to 80, and was very, very active in building a folk dance, primarily Balkan, but I had elements of international and Eastern European, Central European today, we'd call it, folk dance groups, performing groups, teaching, bringing people from all these different countries, even taking tours to these countries, to Macedonia and Serbia.
Was there any resistance from your family when you declared that I'm moving to Europe and I'm going to be a professional folk dancer?
I don't. At that point, I think they embraced it. My family everybody chose pretty esoteric work. One of my brothers was a painter. The other one was a scholar, or is a scholar in ancient magic, and so we're pretty esoteric. He's primarily Greek stuff. The other one worked for the Getty Museum as a restorator and later as a painter. And in a way, my father kind of accepted all of that. But I cut myself off from my family for close to 2 years. I just needed that break, and I don't think they were terrible. My parents were terribly happy about it because they didn't get the chance to see me too often, but they did accept it.
Right.
I mean, they didn't have a choice. I was an adult.
Yeah. You mentioned coming across all of these characters, all these people connected with the state folk ensembles in these various countries or territories in Yugoslavia and Hungary as well, and you've mentioned some of the big names as well of people who ended up coming back to the U.S. and teaching. Steve Murillo, Bob Liebman, Martin Koenig, all these names are very well known in the folk dance community here. But you were there for those pivotal 70s years. I think you went to Hungary during that time as well, and you went to Sarospatak conference. Can you tell us more about your Hungarian research?
Yeah, so let's move into that, because that's really where the Tanchaz comes into my life, and I go into the Tanchaz life. Csaba Pazzi would come to Munich a lot, and he would teach for both ballet schools, and I would always invite him to do workshops in Munich, and even I had a dance group with she's my sister-in-law now. She married my brother, but Margareta Markhorn, Kotansky, we had a group called Gaida. And we would have Csaba also do choreographies for us, and Csaba and Ricky Holden too. Ricky Holden, who was originally from Texas, but had worked for Folkcraft in New Jersey. And Ricky was living in Belgium, and Ricky came, and Ricky was responsible for a lot of the early Balkan recordings that made it to, not the very early, but the sort of the 60s to 70s music that made it to, and Hungarian, that made it to the United States. He had produced 3 records that Csaba put out before the Tanchaz stuff, and Csaba convinced us that there was this movement going on in Hungary that he thought would appeal to international folk dancers. And I think he felt, he's no longer with us, but I think he felt that some of this was similar to what was happening in the United States with regard to the Balkan scene, where there was live music, not necessarily a choreographed dance, but a dance, learning how to dance rather than learning dances.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
So dancing rather than just doing a dance. And Csaba was doing that with some of his stuff before the Tanchaz movement. He was. I noticed this in Munich. He would teach a dance, and he wouldn't necessarily say you have to do 10 of these and 12 of these and 6 of these. You do what you want for the slow part, and the fast part comes, and you do pretty much the same thing for the fast music. So the Frisch and the Lashu. He didn't do a lot of Transylvanian though, but he had a number of dances like that were a little more free, if you want to look at it that way.
Right.
And he knew what was going on with the Tanchaz movement. And Csaba was a thinker. He was also he was a doctor, Csaba Palsy. He'd done he did his research in the Gyöngyös bouquet, the pearly bouquet. He'd written his doctorate work on that. Well, Ricky Holden, and I was sort of the third man there. We organized this thing in Sáros-Patak. I had no idea what it was, but it sounded good from what Csaba was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And Ricky and I got a lot of people to come, and I was part of the organization. And we get there, and wow, it's unbelievable. I was starting to hear that music, that Shebu sound, the early Tanchaz sound, and live music, and a whole new style of teaching, not less talk, more do, repetition, building through doing. That's what I call the Timar model of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And you were asking me about teaching before Americans. We'll get to that because I think it's interesting because I still had a lot of that, explain a lot, try to break things down and explain it more through speaking rather than through doing. And Timar was just, the music started and he built it up from the ground up, which was rather than from the head down, which I think is so different.
Wow, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
So here we are in Sáros-Patak, greeting all these people from maybe from 12, 13 different countries, and it was at this place, and the teacher there, the first year was primarily Timar, Sándor, and Büske, and then she had to go somewhere with the Bartók ensemble. So the second, he had one of his students or one of his dancers accompanying him. And the first year, as I recall, they taught Seiki, the Seiki Tansen, and the musicians that year were the Vizentu. They were the live music for that week, and the second dance cycle, and here was the word dance cycle that was being used, was Doma Hazard, or the Eastern Palots. Yeah. And we did we'd go out in the countryside and we would dance. We danced with some groups from Shatariauhe and that area, and we saw village groups, and they brought groups in, not from Transylvania, because that was a little more difficult. So, and how exciting was that, to learn these men's dances, to learn the Ritka and Magyar tempo, and be able to understand a dance as a structure, that you did an A, B, B, and the C was the closing of the B, and that was, to me, just fascinating to look at this linguistic model that had grown out of the teaching, I guess, not the teaching, but the research of Martin Zurich primarily, who was a structuralist, and he looked at these dances and broke them down that way, like A, B, B, C, or A, B, 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 or especially the men's dances. That was a little simpler than breaking down the couple dances. Mm-hmm. And that was so exciting to me, that you could begin to really, it was poetry in motion, really. You could begin to put together your own dance within the bookends or the boundaries of that particular dance dialect. And Martin, of course, had come up with that movie, that old black and white movie. We used to watch it at your father's also. He had a copy of that 16 millimeter of the dance dialects of Hungary. And that was just beautiful. You know, you look at those films and those movies look like they're from the 20s and 30s, but they were actually from the 60s. And the fact is, they just didn't have enough money to put sound to them always and all that. So that was exciting. I have very fond memories of sitting at your mom and dad's house in Teaneck, and just Friday night putting those on and watching them. They were so exciting because here in the early days, you didn't have that much dance on film, and even young dancers were going to the institutes and watching these things again and again, and then you and members of your dance group later would watch those videos that we took and those things, and you guys would spend 10, 12 hours a day just trying to learn that stuff.
Absolutely. You've said a lot there. I have so many follow-up questions. I'll try to be a little more concise. No. I'm tabling things for the next episode when you come back. But this Sáros-Patak anyanyelvi konferencia, the mother tongue conference, this was geared towards. This was like a folk dance camp.
Well, the anyanyel was something completely different. Sáros-Patak was a folk dance camp or a folk dance seminar. It was a seminar, and that was geared toward any dancer, folk dancer. You didn't have to be Hungarian. People came from Western Europe. I don't think there were too many Asians in the beginning, but Canadians, Americans, Western Europeans, and even a few Eastern Europeans in those early years. I actually was only part of the organization for 78, 79, and then, I think the first one was 78. And then in 80, Susie and I went back to part of it. It had moved from Sáros-Patak. We went back to part of it. And then it sort of fizzled out, because by that time I think there was a lot more going on. The Anyanyelvi conference I didn't go to, but Susie went to, and that was in Budapest. I actually was not. I participated a little bit, but that was a different scene then too. And I can't really speak much about that. When you talk to Susie, she can give you a little more background with that, because even how you found out about that was you had to have some kind of Hungarian connection or background in the United States or Canada. Those were, or Australia, I think those were or Western Europe. But the Sáros-Patak was organized primarily for non-Hungarians.
Is that where you met Susie? Yeah,
we met there. And that's a long story. And right. It's still ongoing. Still a long story, still ongoing.
Right.
But yeah, we met the very first year, and then the second year she came back. And you can ask her about that, because she has her own version of that. And I was very excited that she was coming back, and met her at the train station. And I had a wonderful week. I hope she did too.
Yeah, well, hopefully. He's still married, so.
But that second, it's interesting, because that second year, so the first year was Seiki and the Domahazai, and then there was another thing in there. There was a guy who came in. He was teaching for Peshovar. Martin Peshovar came and gave a lecture, and some other people came and gave lectures that first year. The second year, Martin George came and gave a lecture. But this year we also did the Délalföldi. But the interesting thing was Timur taught the Seiki the way he taught it, and the Domahazai, very, like I said, from the ground up. And then the other teacher, and I can't remember his name, he was a Peshovar student, and he taught Délalföldi, but he taught it directly like Peshovar brothers had notated it in the Sárga Könyv. Are you familiar with the Sárga Könyv?
The yellow book.
The Yellow Book. Yeah, the Yellow Book is a collection of those dances that were on some of the early black and white films from the Institute. And later, Jura and Kodai, I think, I might be wrong, but I know Jura got dancers together and they danced through all those dances from the lava notation and the old black and white silent films. And they put those together with live music. And those the difference is they take one couple or one performance of a dance by villagers or a villager at one time, and it's notated. So it's just like it's almost like a museum piece,
Right.
even though it's moving and all that. But it's not the same thing as out of that they create the I think some people would go into it and see that as these are the elements of the linguistic approach or the language, but they would preserve that just the way it was, and so that's already something happening in Hungary that's interesting. That we could talk about my take on this now, how from Timar it moved from the more geographically general to the village specific. And then, I sometimes share that in some places, some people would say, I'm only doing Gigabachi's Pontozo from the age of that he did from the age of 28 to 30.
Yes.
That's how specific it can get eventually. And
Yeah.
You get these monographs that some people only do. For example, there was a time when mezőség was taught the second year was very popular, but it was more of a generic mezőség, even though it was primarily based on palapkai. Later I learned that all the good variations, or the tricky and the fast variations, were done by Romanians in that area, and that's what Baciu and Jura and people would see these movies, and they would take those variations and bring them into their mezőség. Mm-hmm. And then, someone like Puma would just really focus on that one couple or one guy from Magyar Palapka.
Yeah. Well, things have certainly
so
changed.
That's fascinating.
It's fascinating. It's certainly changed from, and Rabbi Miklos would have been proud of that, of course, seeing that development, of getting very micro. And you moved back, of course, to the U.S. in the early 80s, right?
Yeah, 1980.
Okay, 1980. Yeah. So,
not early though. Oh, well, maybe it was. Maybe it was late '79, early '80. Anyway, right. By '80, I was back in the New York area. Yeah, in New York.
Right. So,
by the way, you mentioned Aman. I was offered. Things weren't going well for me in life and in Munich, and I was really wanted to come back to the United States and be with Susie. But I was offered the artistic directorship of Aman. And Dick Crum was doing it then, and I was offered that. Dick wanted me to do it, and Myman Miller. But yeah. I took a look at what where my life was, what I was doing. It just didn't feel right. I didn't really want to live in Los Angeles. I wanted to be in New York, so I moved to New York, and got started here in New York. And thanks to your father, your dad, helped me. Had me helping in doing some of the footwork for the Hungaria records, for the second Teka record, for the Kodai quartet, and your parents were very, very supportive and helpful, and of course Susie, and then working for the for Marty Koenig and teaching there, and I began to get some other jobs and do seminars and workshops, and always excited to bring in some of the Hungarian. Oh, I wanted to say the second 1979, or it might have been 80. When was the? I guess it was 1980 that Timar came over for the first time to the symposium.
Yes, that was 1980. Yeah, in New Jersey. Yeah,
80, summer of 80. Then it was 79 where Timar taught mezőség, and they had Balázs Guszti come and do Ciga.
Mm-hmm.
That was really exciting. Yeah.
That was in Sarospatak, yeah?
In Sarospatak, yeah.
Right. Well, and of course,
then,
Balázs Guszty's son became a fabulous dancer and went to the Tamburitans, and now is in Pittsburgh. So,
yeah.
and we
met. And Susie and I went and spent a week in Balázs Guszty started his own camp in eastern Hungary. He called it Tsigan Tabor, and that was that was primarily for gypsy, for Roma. I mean, they didn't use, it's funny, you don't hear that word so often in Hungary, Roma, and that was a really fun camp. And then we went back and spent time with Guszty and his first wife, and we met Balázs, we met Ricky when he was like 6 or 7, and a fabulous dancer already then.
Oh yeah,
you know?
For sure.
So there are all these connections. I mean, the connections just never stop. And we brought Guszty, Susie and I brought Guszty over to teach at Stockton, and then he did some workshops on the East Coast as well.
You know, another connection that I see, and you might not see, but Sarospatak is only a few miles from where your Slovak Carpato-Rusin family's from, and
exactly, yeah, they're from there, and we actually went back well, Susie and I then organized some tours with Batu the last 2 years. Unfortunately, this year we won't be able to go because of the COVID. We had planned on doing Western and Northern Hungary Northwestern Hungary this year. The first year we did, we concentrated on the southern part and the Délslavy also. But last year we were up in Kosha, and we actually had workshops with Slovaks and Hungarian, a mixed village. Nagy, what's it called? It's slipping my mind. Anyway, it's right near Kasha, right outside of there. It's a very, very organized group of dancers, and they're mixed of Hungarian, Slovak, and even Carpatho-Rusin. So I would love to go back to that region. It's very interesting.
Well, these are tours, by the way, that anyone can sign up for. These are in the English language tours, and you can go and you go to villages and you learn you eat the great food. The musicians are there. You learn the dancing. So these are like folk dance tours, and it's really, really cool what Steve does.
Right, and we have mixed. We had both Hungarian speakers, and a lot of the people who come on it have. In the beginning, we thought, since we're on this tour thing, we thought, let's try. I talked about you. Let's try to do dances that would not necessarily be couple dances, but in the long run, most of the people who came, I would say 75 to 80% came with a partner. So, but we always made sure that we're, in that style of the Tanchaz. So there's a partyere, the couple changing, and also try to get, as many non-couple dances too, because I think there's a lot of non-couple dancing in Hungary. Not as much as a couple dancing, but there's plenty of it in the Hungarian diaspora or in the Hungarian dance repertoire.
Mm-hmm. Steve, you mentioned Stockton and the camp, and I know there's the EEFC's Balkan camps and Mendocino Folklore Camp and all the other various camps that you've taught at and festivals and the like. And I'm curious. It's one thing to say it. Teaching from the ground up versus from the head down, but most of your clientele there, the camp goers, are used to the old antiquity dances, the kolo, the circle dances, which are more rigid than the Hungarian Tanchaz style of dances. When you do teach to them, and I've seen you teach mezőség, and I've seen you teach kalotaszeg and Romanian stuff too, invirtitas and the like. How does that go? What kind of success do you have, and how do people at these places, adopt and respond to that different method of teaching?
Well, it depends. At Stockton, you have 55 minutes to present something, and they want a dance description beforehand. So often what we'll do is we will put together a sequence to a particular piece of music, because you're not having live music. You're not having, so you pretty much are doing the old way of doing things. But the difference being, you're pulling up dance motifs and dance sequences that are closer to the source. I hate that word authentic, because anything could be authentic. Then you explain to people, or we would explain to people that this can be done freestyle, or whatever that means. You don't have to follow this sequence, but for learning purposes, I find, and especially for people who are, maybe just having a primary exposure to this the first time, they need something that they can hold on to in their head, because that's how they're thinking. Differently, though, when we had camps of, for example, the symposium, or we had the Barátság, or some of these Csipka-tábor I've never been to, I wish I could get there, or the Titi-tábor, those grew out of people open to doing more freestyle dancing and learning things, and they're more comfortable with the language, and that's how they learn it. But not in Stockton. Some other places, we've had Gusti came and he tried to do he taught the Tzigán material as just freestyle, but my suggestion, because people are always watching him, was put together a sequence that builds on, from the basic on up, and that works better in the beginning, and then you it's a little bit like you hook them, and then once you got them, then they're interested in going and investigating it deeper.
Yeah.
Same with Balkan. Same with you can't you can't expect people to get up and learn all these different variations to a Pravo Horo and be able to then just freely do it. No, they need some. Most of them need some practice and need some kind of structure.
Yeah. I remember my dad was helping Batu prepare for one of these Stockton things and dancing on the video. I don't know if you remember this, and Batu was doing some kind of step, and my dad said, "What's the name of this step?" And Batu was like, "What do you mean, what's the name?" And my dad's like, "You need a name for this step in order so we can notate it, And then Batu said,
yeah.
"Oh, his name, his name is Gyula, His name is."
Well, one of my favorite moments, I think it was with Jura and Zhuji, when they were teaching at Barátság, and this was supposed to be a place where people were open to all this. And all of these American folk dance, well, not all of them, but many of them, especially some of the women, wanted to know what the signal was. What's the signal for changing a step? Like in Mezőség, how does the guy signal? And they just, when it was translated to them, they kind of looked like, what? Signal? No. The guy changes a step, and the woman, the woman reacts.
Yes.
But people wanted, they wanted the secret signal.
Right.
And it's like, there are things like squeezing the arm a little, or tossing a little more, getting out of the way, whatever. There are things, but I think that a lot of the non-Hungarians, especially who were there, they wanted, they wanted more information. They wanted more, it was, or maybe the women were just saying, what can you tell these guys? These guys aren't giving us any direction. That's really what it was. It wasn't.
That's right.
No signals. Just so. And they it's like Batu said, Jula or something. Yes. They looked at it. And Hungarians, when they teach non-Hungarians, and Hungarians in general, and I remember how many times I wanted to be lauded. I wanted to be patted on the head, and you don't get the compliments that you want sometimes. Yes. And I remember. I said to, I think it was Batu, that I said, come on, Batu, they're having trouble. They wanted, akar, he said, akarni nem elég. He said, it's not enough to want to do it.
Yes. You have to do well.
And, you know,
I wanted to.
and Gusti was a little bit like that too. That you know, that you know, Hungarian. You know, they worked hard to get there. They worked very hard, and that's one of my sayings. I said, you know, the best Hungarian dancers are always going to be Hungarians, but the worst Hungarian dancers will probably be Hungarian too, and we as non-Hungarians kind of fit in there somewhere. But I used to say, why are they so good? And you know, I don't believe in this BS that it's in your blood. I believe it's in your sweat. It's not in your blood, but it's in the sweat. You know, how hard did you work to do it? Okay, if you're going, I used to say to people, you know, we dance this once a week for an hour, and then, you know, the next week we come back and do it again for maybe 6 to 8 weeks. And I said half of it has to be reviewed, or quarters of it the next week. I said Hungarians go 3-4 times a week. Some of them dance in ensembles as well. I said that, you know, it's the drive they have to learn it that gets so good. I mean, there's some guys I saw last time I went to Hungary from Japan and from China who are amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, and you know the work you put into dancing when you guys were young, and I remember Attila. You guys would you guys just couldn't get enough of it. And I said that passion to do it, where's that come from? I don't know. I'd have to interview you about where that comes from, or I'd have to interview, you know, Iliko's kids. Why are they so passionate about playing Hungarian music? Yeah. Is it because they're Hungarian? Probably a little bit, but I mean that plays a big role in it. But for the non-Hungarian, yeah, you know,
well,
I believe. I believe, and I'll say this.
Right. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I believe that anybody, if they put in the drive and effort, can get pretty good at it. And you know, and I used to always use Jura as, you know, as this blood thing. Okay, his family comes from, you know, the northern reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You know, and there are people who, myself included, I look at old films of me when I was working really hard at this with Batu and with Jura, and I was pretty good at it. I mean, I would never be as good as any of these Hungarians who made it their livelihood and all that, but I worked really hard, and I was able to get pretty good at it. And I loved when your father, I think, put this whole thing together. Could only a Hungarian win a Zsa Gabor look-alike contest? You know, that was a really good question.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Well,
because
what gets me though with about you is I know you mostly as a Hungarian dancer, and many people in our community do. But wait a second. I mean, you might be even better with Albanian dancing or Macedonian dancing, and that's you know, almost freakish to me in a very good way. You know, I don't know what your true. If I said, okay, Steve, we're going on a deserted island, and you can only do one form of dance or one type of nationality's dance, what would you choose? Where does it really lie? You know.
You know, I don't. I think that Macedonian and Albanian border areas where I would probably choose. But I'm going to say something. I think it's easier to be good at Macedonian Albanian dancing than it is to be good at Hungarian dancing. I think there's a proficiency in. I mean, it's easier for me. Maybe that's the right way to say. I think that the Hungarian, you know, and when you talk again, when you say Hungarian dance, what are you talking about? You know, because you know, a lot of people look at the leggingess or those dances as the pinnacle of being a good Hungarian dancer, whereas, you know, Batu or somebody would understand too that even, and Jura too, that sometimes just doing a simple Dunan Tuli Chardash can be, you know, all these dances depending on what you invest into them and the deeper you go into them, the more you realize, I hope, how little you know about them. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. I do, and that's the thing about Hungarian is, and I know because we became very micro, thanks to micro in terms of like the person we're going to dance the dance style of, and not just the person, but the year and the street that it was filmed on and all that. Thanks to the Tanchaz movement, we've gotten there. These other countries, unfortunately, just haven't. They didn't have that, and their dance styles are different because they're more or less circle based.
Well, and their dances are circle and community based. I mean, not that Hungarian dance isn't community based, but Hungarian dance historically, it focused more. I mean, in a way, if you look at dance as a representation of sort of human consciousness development and stuff, as you got into Central Europe and stuff, the individual began to emerge because of political and historical consequences, as opposed to in the Balkans, where the mindset was more communal.
Yes.
So it's interesting in Romania, for example, where you have the fortuitous, where you have groups of men dancing more or less the same pattern and step, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the Kotansky or whatever. It's a little more like the Seiki férfi táncok, where they dance in a circle, and if you went to Budapest, you'd see it more individual, but if you saw it in the original Seiki, it was more of a communal thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is that right? Do you understand? Do you see what I'm saying?
I totally see what you're saying. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And and you saw in Hungary the older style Vermunks were the Western and the Southern Vermunks, which were again circle Vermunk, Kör Vermunk. Whereas when you got up to what developed further in Szatmár is or what we know about what developed in Szatmár later was a lot more individualistic.
And this was, of course, the effect of the Renaissance and how the Ottoman occupation plays in and all that stuff. So there's, Steve, for those of us around in the 80s, we remember the Guzsai dance group, which I mentioned in the beginning. Tell me how that came to be and who was in that dance group.
Sure. Well, before that, when I first came back in 72, Susie was dancing with Köti Laci, and Susie had started, and Hadhazi Alona and a few people had started a group called Ungareska.
Right.
And they were beginning to get interested, and Susie had gone to Hungary in 70. Late 70s. I came back in 80. Excuse me, not 72. I came back in 1980,
right.
And so late 70s. They were doing. They were beginning to get interested in the Tanchaz style and movement and direction. And a big part of the Tanchaz style and movement was the Hungarian Transylvanian dances. I mean, that's where the word came from, even Tanchaz, and so people were interested in that stuff. And I came in and joined that. And then it lasted for a while. And then Laci left, I think, or he was studying at NYU, and Susie was studying dance ethnology at NYU too. You can talk to her more about that. She knows the evolution of that. But then in the early 80s, Susie and I got invited by the Balkan Arts Center, became the Ethnic Arts Center, became the Society for whatever. Yeah. I don't even know the name anymore, with Marty Koenig and Ethel Rain.
Yeah.
And we taught one of the first Tanchaz series. And we chose Mezőségi, and we taught that for a long time. And out of that, we thought, we wanted to have a dance group. We didn't have kids yet, so we started Guzsai. Your dad helped us with that name. I'm pretty much sure he helped us with that name. We came across it, and it meant spinning room. And our idea, Susie and my idea, was, could we have a dance group, a performing group, or people who were interested in learning these dances well enough that when we put together a choreography, we could just draw on their ability to to just dance, along the lines of what was going on with Bartok Ensemble, with the Kodai Ensemble. I think the Kodai was a big influence. The Kodai Kamara Edutesh that broke away from, that was that interim period where Jura and at that point Zhuji and Hush, all these these early former dancers with the state ensemble, they had left the state ensemble because I think it just was time. It was time for them to move on. I don't know the exact, they had their problems, and Timar was running the state ensemble, and they were all students of Timar, but I think they were all pushing the envelope a little further. They wanted to go a little further, a little deeper, and so they influenced us by then, and we brought them over. Jura and Batsu, and you mentioned Shara Ferry, to work with us, and they actually taught us, like they did what was the Toronto group's name?
Kodai.
The Kodai. Thank you. And they would, I think they were the first. I think Kalman Senior Daisiga was the first one to invite Jura over to teach some of his choreographies. So they taught us Kodai Kabara Edutesh in Budapest choreographies, Finnish choreographies. We did, at that point, we learned to do, and Susie and I did a couple choreographies. We did a Mezzoshake, we did a Dunan Tuli, then Batsu came over and did a Dunan Tuli, and Jura came over and did a Sotmari, and Batsu did a Kalataseg choreography for us. And so I wanted people, I didn't want to do choreographies right away, but I found out, and these were primarily non-Hungarians in the group. For a while, Kozsbor István danced with us, and even for a while, there was another Hungarian who was living here for a while, danced with us. So, but mostly non-Hungarians who came out of the Balkan folk dance movement and out of our Tanchaz classes, and wanted to do Hungarian dancing. So that lasted for several years until we had Jesse in '87 and Maya in '89, and by the time Maya was born, it was just more than we could. We were living up here in Valley Cottage, and it just became more than we could handle, and anyway, we at that point, I have to say too, I'm going to just say this too, you Hungarians, you guys were really pushing up too. You were already developing your bands, your orchestras. You guys took it over, and that's the way it should be. And I said, there's no point in us non-Hungarians who are doing this style of dance to continue to do it, if the Hungarians are picking it up and are doing the same thing, because, that's the way it should be. And you guys were better than us, so.
No, well, it was a different.
I could have held my own. We could have held our own.
Right.
I'm sure a lot of people. Anyway,
it was a different. It was a different. Membership, right? You say they're mostly non-Hungarians. They're a bit of older than what we were doing with Hungaria, and of course we were in New Jersey, right? So. Already, so.
And you guys were younger, and you guys had your language, but the other thing is that in the back of my mind, I still wasn't achieving with the non-Hungarians the level that I had been able to enjoy and experience with Hungarians. And for some reason, I don't know, was that me? Was it them? Was it the involvement? I always just felt like, we looked good. I remember one Pontozo we went to, and Daisiga Kalman and Sompo Andor, and everybody pointed to our group. We were kind of the only non-Hungarian group, and said, "This is the future of Hungarian dance in North America." That was a Pontozo we went to up in, I think it was Toronto. And or St. Catharines.
St. Catharines. Anyway, exactly. St. Catharines.
And that's what that I was really proud that we had brought it that far. And I think that year was a year that also even Halmos Bela was there, and you guys, they played music for us, and it was just like, wow, we'd kind of, we did the right thing.
You did the right thing, Steve. That was the mid '80s. There was the time period when you were still seeing red boots and choreographies, and the old style colliding with the Tanchaz style, which of course is the older style, but anyway, we call it the newer style, and that's what Gujoy, that improvisative kind of spirit and the insistence on live music, in fact, was very special. And we had Hungaria, we were already doing that, but we were doing stage choreographies as well, things about the immigration, things about the 56 revolution, a little different type of choreographies. You guys went up there and you were almost like the New York version of the Kodály ensemble in Budapest, that spirit, that mentality.
And we had David Skews, who was very, may he rest in peace. He was playing that kind of music, and we had live music too, which was a lot of fun. I mean, but when you have these amateur ensembles, you're limited. And in those days, you had a few more places where you might be able to. We would perform at Columbia Folk Dancers or stuff like that. But there weren't that many places to really, unless you had a tour agent or somebody there weren't that many places to perform. Yeah. And I found that sometimes the dynamics and the politics of people who wanted to perform, it got in the way of my mission, which was to really bring the level of dance up higher and higher. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know what I mean, but people are anxious to get on the stage in a costume and dance, and that wasn't my main purpose or point for doing this. And although I see how if you're going to be in a performing group, you want to perform.
No, for sure, I understand. But that's the payoff.
But that same thing happened with the Kodály Együttes and the state ensemble. The Kodály Együttes, that they wanted the older dancers were perfectly happy performing the older stuff that they knew, but Batu and Jura and Mickey and all those people, and Shara, they wanted to take it deeper and to a level that was no longer, that sort of removed the word folk out of it. They wanted it to be, they wanted it to be a dance style of its own. When Batu first saw Antonio Gades, and he just said, wow, this is, they've taken a traditional form, flamenco, and they've elevated it to such a high level. And I think Jura and Batu wanted to do that too, and have done that. And also now you have people like Roman Shani, who's doing some pretty, and then you have the people who go back the other way. Let's go back to the basics, Let's go back to the, and I find it so fascinating. We went to the Seiki Tanztabor, and here where it all started, Seik, and they're bringing in, Sisi and Hush to teach, because they're bringing in people from Hungary, because those people know it, better, or I don't know if they know it better, but they remember it and they've kept it going and they've researched it deeper. It's such a conundrum. It's such an interesting phenomenon.
Yes, it is. Steve, you teach, before I let you go, I want to ask you, I know you're teaching during non-COVID times, that kids dance in the New York City area, K through 12. Are you teaching them any Hungarian?
Yes, I do that too. I do, not so much couple dancing, but I have done some couple dancing, but often I'll do some, with kids in the 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and sometimes I've gone down as low as 3rd grade. I did a Konas dance, and that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You can, and then Susie and I did something last year with 1st graders or kindergartners, I think, and they came out singing a Dunantu song in Hungarian, and she taught that to them. And then we just put together, like any Hungarian group would do for little kids.
Right.
You take elements of Hungarian dance, but traditional music, and we had live music with the Vanover Caravan. And I don't know if you know Bill and Livia Vanover. They're very active in all kinds of folk music, especially well known in American. He used to play a lot with Pete Seeger and stuff.
Wow.
And when they do international programs for kids in schools. It's a week-long internship, and at the end of the week, the kids dance in some form of costume for the other kids and their parents to live music. And I've done that also in some schools out here where we live, with live music sometimes and sometimes not. And I've done, I've done some just basic folk dance. And it depends on what in 1 year, in one school I go to, they ask me for different, they have different themes each year, and I find something that works. And I often turn to Hungarian because it's so beautiful. And there's usually always somebody in one of my classes who has Hungarian ancestry, or may even be, an immigrant.
That's so cool.
Immigrant, yeah.
That's so cool. So you have and here you are, you talk about the irony of Sisi and Ildikó teaching in Szék, and here you're teaching Hungarians their own folk dance, potentially in New York City. Yeah.
Well, there's sort of that, there's that thing, Öcsi, I think, too. If, and Csaba, policy, back to Csaba, he talked about this. What was the main reason why the Tanchaz movement was able to take place in Budapest? And you know what his take on it? He's a scientist. He was a scientist, besides an artist and a dancer. He said the most important thing to have, first of all, was expendable time, free time. Because without free time, people would have no interest or money or anything to go, and they had to get away from it, far enough away from it. I mean, people had stopped folk dancing more or less, except maybe Csardas for decades before the Tanchaz came into being. There's this sort of saying that why should we dance anymore? We have these professionals on the stage who come twice a year and they do it on television, But I think that people needed free time. I think they also needed to get out of the house to meet other people. And you had some brilliant minds like Timar and Martin and Pessovar and even Novak and all these people who had different takes on it. Susie did a lot of interviews with Novak and Timar about why the Tanchaz, and she'll talk to you about that. I think it's fascinating. But it's the right time, right place, right political environment, and this whole nomado, I don't know, the nomad generation, that there was just a resurgence, and it's cyclical. It's happened again, and it's interesting how it went. It happened in Hungary, and in all these Eastern European countries that still had a little finger link to their folklore and their dance and their music, how they went about interpreting it and reinvigorating it. The Greeks are fascinating. I mean, we could talk for days about this stuff, and I don't know that we would get any closer to the right answer if there is one. But I think in Budapest, when Palfi told me that, I said, for young people to all of a sudden get interested or find an interest in this, it took leadership. And it took, as they said, some free time and some, and look where it's going now. I mean, I don't want to get involved with the political aspects, but it was made clear to me at the Tanchaz Talk when I saw what kind of pamphlets were out there that this can also serve a purpose for, and I don't know that the purpose is necessarily the right purpose, but it can also serve a purpose for other ends. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, it's this is I think a very good place to stop in terms of time. We're speaking of time, I think you're right. We can go for days and weeks probably talking, Steve. And like I said at the beginning, there's a lot to cover. And I really appreciate your inspirational speech that, and when you think of non-Hungarians who have really made it their own, made Hungarian dancing their own, I always think of you and your wife first and foremost. And it's an inspiration for us to aim to be that way as Hungarians. And again, Hungarian is just a little part of what you're really good at. And I appreciate all your energy. You've been at this for 5 decades now, Steve. I think you have maybe a couple more left here to keep giving to the keep giving to the masses.
If I can just leave you with this message, as much as I've been blessed learning from Hungarians, your parents, you, your sister, and all these people we mentioned, Bachu and Ildiko and Jura and Julie and Hush and Sisi and all, Kalman Sr. and then the Dreisiger. I like to think in all that I've learned from you guys that I brought a little bit of my culture into their lives, and I see that, which is important to me. That I have some of my fondest moments, and I like to consider some of my best friends these people, not just in the Hungarian community, but I know, and you mentioned Raif and Merita and these different people I've met. I like to think that we share in common a passion and love of something that's just proven by time, and that's dance and music and custom and food and language, and it's crossed borders. It does cross borders, and I would encourage anybody who gets interested in this to become open-minded. Don't become closed by all of this, because it's an opening. It's an opening into a world of humanity.
I think that's where you were going before when you mentioned the two sides of the coin. This should be a starting point, opening up the rest of the world. And you have opened up a lot of things about Eastern Europe and Central Europe to me, and including some great friends like Raif and Marita. And I appreciate all that, Steve. Well, this is a good place to stop, I think. And I'd like to thank Steve Kotansky for joining Tanchaz Talk. And until next time, this is Kalman Magyar Öcsi bidding you farewell.